time since I've done a show because I've been very busy on this conference called Cancel Proof Christianity, which is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm joined by the other person, we're sort of co-organizers of this conference. It's going to take place on September 25th, 2021. And I think I would definitely encourage people to come to this because we're going to be dealing with some very important topics. And the book that's coming out along with the conference is called Cancel Proof Christianity. Stop complaining and build your own civilization. All right. So Jeff Dornick, who's the CEO of Gatekeepers, kind of my boss over here in the internet world and who runs America First, right?
Freedom First, but yeah, pretty much.
Freedom First. Yeah, America First is probably something they're probably all in jail for what we
probably.
No, but he's part of Freedom First and also at the Gatekeepers online. All right, so Jeff, I could go on for hours and hours and hours about Cancel Proof Christianity, but I would just like to hear you tell me what Cancel Proof Christianity is and why we're having a summit on it on September 25th, 2021, about which people can get more information at cancelproofchristianity.com.
Yeah, well, it's been interesting because before you even kind of approach this idea of having a summit and really kind of going down this path that we're now heading down, I've been talking on my podcast and in my shows and everything about how we're so reliant upon the left in so many different spheres, whether it's, obviously the one that everybody understands is big tech and social media and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of people don't understand. We rely on the left for our jobs. We rely on the left for our news, for our education, for, even now within churches, we're relying on the left for basically everything to function, all the way down to who owns our grocery stores. The majority of the chains are owned by the left. We are so reliant upon the left and upon the globalists and these establishment types that we have to figure out how can we, number one, not be reliant upon them. Because I feel like they could at any moment rip the rug from underneath us. We saw this with Lauren Witzke and how her bank account closed. We're seeing this with education. We're seeing this with churches. We're seeing pastors getting pushed out of their churches because they hold traditional conservative views. And all of a sudden, you got these new, young, hip millennials coming in and taking over, and they're like, "No, we're going full on Bernie Sanders AOC in this church." It's getting out of control. And so for me, when we started bringing this idea up, I love the idea because we're basically setting up the establishment of it being a place that's self-sufficient, not reliant upon the left, not reliant upon big corporations, big entities, all these people that are corrupt and all that kind of stuff. And we can just rely on ourselves, rely on being faithful to God, rely on God's word. And we can actually be faithful instead of feeling like we have to jump through all these hoops in order to avoid getting fired or canceled or deplatformed. So that's really when you really brought up this idea. I love the concept, and I know we'll be diving into a lot of the details and that sort of thing as well.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of people are bringing this up. Andrew Torba his name always comes up all the time because he's been talking a lot about having a parallel economy. And what I'm trying to say is I totally am down with everything Andrew Torba is talking about, but I want to reframe that a little bit, that we have to build our own civilization. That's the thing. It's not just rebuilding the economy or rebuilding an infrastructure. The starting point is we can't complain anymore. Okay, I don't want to complain about people getting canceled by left-wing people or fake Christians, fake conservatives, because we've complained about it to death. We know exactly how it works. People, they take away your job, they take away your bank account, they take away your friends, they take away your access to the media, all these things. So let's stop complaining about it. We need to build. We have to build our own institutions. And a lot of people have been talking about this. I see this all over the place. But I think that what we're trying to do on September 25th is we're saying, okay, let's have a summit and actually iron out the details. So there has to be a method to the madness. So that we have to have some kind of plan or a structure. And that's where the book came from, where I'm trying to lay down what are the biblical virtues that would be involved. What are the parts of the Bible that you can really reflect on prayerfully to try to get some guidance from God to how to deal with this. That's how I came upon Jeremiah 29:5, which I think just speaks perfectly to our current situation, because when the Hebrews were being exiled from Babylon, God tells them, he tells the exiles, I'm sorry, they were being exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. God tells them, you're going to have to live in a pagan nation that hates you. I'm telling you to live there. Don't listen to the false prophets who say that you're going to be able to still stay in a holy kingdom and live the holy life that you had before. You've messed up. I'm punishing you. I'm exiling you. But what God tells them is you're going to have to pray for the pagan civilization that surrounds you, but you have to build your own houses and you have to grow your own food. You have to plant your gardens, build your houses, and you have to eat from what you grow. You have to be self-sufficient. You can't be dependent on the Babylonians for anything. And, the problem is, if you're living in Babylon, which is where we are right now in America, I hate to tell you this, but we're living in Babylon. You can't be dependent on the thinkers of Babylon. You can't be dependent on the farmers of Babylon to give you your food. You have to be able to be self-sufficient enough that you can live out your Christian faith, and that does not mean that you're going to lose the ability to feed your families. One of the things that I've tried to do in putting together the materials and the curriculum for this series of conferences is I've tried to really have a laser focus on what our priority is. Our priority is not making sure that Ben Shapiro can give a speech at Berkeley. That's not the kind of cancel culture that matters, really, or that is an issue. We're talking about specifically when Christian men know that if they live out their faith publicly, that they stand a good chance of losing their ability to feed their families. And in the current context, in the current culture we live in, if you lose your job, the chance that your wife will file for divorce increases exponentially. And so for a lot of Christian men, if they lose their livelihood, they know that is a snowball effect, that they could very easily lose their families. So unless we work on building up this civilization, an alternate civilization where people can go feed their families, make a living, and they can live independently from the system, I don't think you're going to have Christian men standing up for the gospel. You're just not. It's just not going to happen. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Jeff, but that's kind of the picture that I had. And then maybe you can talk a little bit about how we try to break it down into different areas. The church, schools, the workplace, and the media. There's 4 really that are the main pillars that we're looking at.
Well, yeah, and I think with each of those 4 main pillars, like as you laid out, again, we're dealing with education, we're dealing with we're dealing with the church, we're dealing with the media, or the workplace, and then we're dealing with like the arts and media and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's really important to understand that in each of those specific areas, there is a major problem with cancel culture. There is a major problem with people, like you were saying, not feeling like they can actually be forthright with their positions for fear of either getting fired or losing their job. And I think that to a certain degree, the left, and again, this is looking at strictly a secular perspective, the left, they don't have those same kind of fears. They can be as wild and crazy and out there as they possibly want, but for whatever reason, for those of us that are conservatives, we have to be reserved because we're the ones that if we mess up once, we get fired or we get deplatformed or censored or whatever it might be. And so I think to a certain point, we've kind of been neutered on the right to where we can't actually go out and fully engage in this battle, because that's what this is. This is a spiritual battle that we're waging in this country. And we have a lot of men that are being held back for fear of losing literally everything. And I think that if we can begin to establish these different spheres, like what you were talking about, I think that we can systematically be able to give the power back to these leaders of these families to actually go out there and feel free to actually voice the truth and proclaim the truth. And that goes for the gospel, that goes for politics, that goes for in education, the academia, wherever it might be. But we have to free everybody up. And I think specifically when we're dealing with things within, I know starting with education is really kicking off. And I think that's so vitally important. And one of the interesting things is that I've had a few people say, well, why don't you start with the church? Shouldn't the church be the first thing? And I've been responding in this way, and I'm curious your thoughts on this. But when you think about it, education is the root problem of what's happening in the church, because the pastors are learning all of their faulty theology, all their faulty ideology. They're being influenced in college and in seminary, and they're doing it to the churches. If we start with churches, the seminaries, the colleges, they're still going to keep churning out all these leftist ideological, pastors over and over and over again. We've got to get down to the root issue. And I think it starts with education, and we've got to get a strong biblical voice within the educational sphere.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, of course I agree with you, because we came up with what we wanted to do was we're going to have one conference for each of these 4 areas. So we're starting with the schools, and then we're going to the churches, then we're going to the workplaces, and then the capstone is the media. And so those are all going to be coming over the course of the next year. The reason why I think schools are a better place to start than the churches is, number one, schools right now are the hot topic on everyone's minds. Okay, we have to strike while the iron is hot. I've never seen these many Americans so outraged over what's going on with the schools, whether it's the COVID restrictions or what have you. Now, for the first time, you have a lot of Christians who understand that the Christian schools are not better than the public schools. For a long time, that was something that was very hard for people to understand. And now we're at a stage where the answer before, among a certain part of our movement, was just everybody should homeschool. Well, guess what? If Christian men can't keep their jobs, then there goes homeschooling, because you don't have any income coming in, so you can't support the family. So your choices are getting whittled down. So I think schools are the best starting focus, because of the fact that right now it's like we have the country's attention, and schools have an immediate thing that we can do. We can work on launching independent schools. I've been helping people to put on business plans of how they can launch schools in their homes, in their churches, etc. We can do that. And that's what the first conference is going to be. It's going to be about looking at each of the major disciplines and why Christians have to have a plan for how they're going to staff that discipline and how they're going to school children in those disciplines. I think also in terms of a life cycle, school, we're children before we are adults. So it's important to look at the schools first, because, that's where we start our life, is, in the education process. But I can see what people are saying, because they feel like the churches have to be the focal point. I think it's good to have a little bit of time to first work on the schools and to build momentum, because I don't know what you think. I'm curious about your opinion on this, Jeff. I think when you try to tackle the churches, then you're going to have to really wrestle with the Antichrist spirits. Okay, now this is one of the things that I talk about in my book, which I think is different from other books that have dealt with this idea of trying to withdraw, things like the Benedict option, is I try to look really closely and frankly at the Antichrist spirit and the role of the Antichrist church in canceling people, because I think we have tried to avoid talking about that, but it's a real problem. Jesus Christ warned us that there would be wolves dressed in sheep's clothing. He said that there would be people who don't practice what they preach. Paul said that Satan would come dressed as an angel of light. We have many warnings about an Antichrist church that was going to appear. And I think we can see it. We can see that a lot of our churches, not just the liberal churches, they're far gone, but also even some of the supposedly conservative churches who will play the role of being the big conservative reformer publicly. And then behind the scenes, they're forcing people to sign non-disclosure agreements. They're telling people to shut up. They're calling up people's churches and having them be under church discipline because they're being too controversial. So the Antichrist church is a big part of cancel culture. So when we get to the part about the churches, I just think we need to be really well prepared to be able to tackle all that, because that's going to be a huge beast, don't you think? That's something where you're going to have people who have been out there representing themselves as warriors against cancel culture that we're going to have to criticize and say, no, you're actually part of the Antichrist church. You're a fake warrior, because we know what you've been doing behind the scenes, and you've been able to keep everybody quiet about it, but we're not going to be quiet anymore. What do you think is the end goal in the churches? Should it be, I think it's to found small New Testament churches, that have bivocational pastors, that are on a small scale, and we need to get away from the mega churches. We need to get away from the denominations. But I'm curious what you think would be the goal with the churches.
Yeah, I think for me the goal would be like you were saying to go smaller New Testament churches. One of the things that I've been saying quite often is that I think that the model of the mega church is one of the primary reasons why the church is failing so much. And this, you're not going to have NDAs if all of the churches were staying small at like 100 people, maybe 150 people. Like you're not dealing with that. You're dealing with the NDAs and the non-disclosure agreements when you're dealing with multi-million-dollar incomes for these pastors and these churches and things like that. Because if you take down the church, all of a sudden you take down their livelihood, like what we were saying. And so they're terrified, and it's a business, really. So for me, what I really see as the alternative in the solution would be to have like a loose affiliation, to where instead of having a denomination that's more authoritarian and then cramming everything down everybody's throat, it's more there as support and more networking and connecting people to each other and things like that. But each of these churches, though, are extremely independent, and you're not having that level of influence that like we see in like the Southern Baptist Convention or different things like that. To me, it would be more of an administrative assistant almost to the local churches, and a loose affiliation of networking together for resources and conferences and support and accountability for pastors, as opposed to the standard denominational focuses that I think everybody's doing.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think one of the issues with the churches as well is the economies of scale with churches turn them into corporations. I mean, that to me is the perfect example of an antichrist church. It's a church that's functioning like a corporation, that's using business practices like mandatory arbitration, non-disclosure agreements, that's hiding behind the First Amendment protections because they're using that as part of a free market libertarian defense of their own practices. Basically, claiming that they're a religious organization means that they're immune to regulation that they would not be immune to if they were not labeled a religious organization. So that basically means that they can do things that would be unethical or illegal. It was done by someone who didn't claim that it was a religious organization. This is a huge problem on our side, because the whole religious liberty argument has been articulated through the perspective of corporations and elites and the people who are owners of businesses, because their whole religious liberty argument is really just the free market libertarian Cato Institute Heritage Foundation argument for corporations with a religious veneer spray painted over it. It's sort of saying Hobby Lobby doesn't need to pay taxes or doesn't need to pay for their health insurance for their employees because of this clause, or they should be able to fire people that they want to or not. It's all the owners having right to conduct business as they please. That's a very valid argument to make as a free market libertarian, but that's not religion. That's not the real true core of religious liberty, because you're not defending the conscience rights of the average Christian who wants to be able to live their life out and not have to fear losing their jobs. So I think like the entire religious liberty advocacy industry it's a dead end at this point. That is not, and it's funny because in the Southern Baptist Convention, the name of the agency was called the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And I think that they are the perfect example of where that ended up. We know what the ERLC did under Russell Moore. It didn't end up somewhere good. So I think that for the churches, it's interesting that people have told you that. That it's interesting feedback that they felt like that should be the first part. I do think that they are an important anchor to all of this. I mean, we have to have functioning churches. But I think what's tough about it is the fact that our entire understanding of what a church is now so thoroughly corrupted by this culture that has convinced us that a church is like a business. It's like a corporation. It's like a holding company or something that just happens to be nonprofit and then happens to have tax exemptions, that it's very hard for us to step back and ask, what was the New Testament church supposed to look like? Yeah. And I think that the bigger the church is, the more that cancel culture has its hooks in it, because there's more things that you don't want to lose. You're afraid of losing. And then the minute that you have lots of things that you're afraid of losing, you're cancelable, because people can use that as a hook to control you.
Yeah, well, also, I think going along with that as well, part of what makes confronting the issue of the church so complicated is we're not just dealing with a practical, procedural thing. I think within the academic world, it can get a little complicated, I'm sure, but to me it feels more straightforward, right? When you're dealing with the church, you're dealing with a lot of different spheres within that one sphere, and one of those that's going to be extremely difficult to confront and deal with and figure out how to maneuver is the theological one, because within the theology, you have different views of salvation. You have different views of the role of the pastor. You have different views of the roles of elders. What's the difference between elders and deacons and a pastor? That's some theological things that from denomination to denomination and different sect within Christianity, everybody has a different view on that. And so it's kind of hard to get down to the root issue because there's not really a common central, a fundamental establishment within the church, because everybody's kind of got their own system. So I think that it's going to be a very difficult, tricky beast to tackle, because you have so many different variations of what we know as the church in America.
Well, and you also have this huge layer of people who they may believe themselves, or they've gotten other people to believe that they have been warriors all of these years against these forces of cancel culture and these forces of secularization and these forces of, adulteration of the religion. But actually, a lot of them, they are plugged into the system, that in a lot of the things that they're doing, particularly behind the scenes, many of the people who present themselves as warriors, culture warriors or religious warriors, are actually a big part of the problem. They're the kind of people who will drive me out from a religious organization because there's a lot of reasons why they cancel people, and that's one of the things that I try to deal with in the book. Why does the Antichrist church cancel so many Christians, even as they are saying to the public that they're defending religious liberty? And I think a lot of it is because the fake bride of Christ and the real bride of Christ cannot coexist. The fake bride has to cancel the real bride, because if you have real Christianity, it will always undermine, it will always conquer over fake Christianity. And we have a lot of fake Christianity. I think that, there's just not that many churches and not that many Christian venues that are authentic, and that's nothing to say against individual Christians. It's just the reality of the fallen nature that we live in America, unfortunately. So, but that's the good news is that we're not dealing with that just yet. First, we're dealing with the schools, which will be a little bit more straightforward. I think that the key with schools, and I think that this will help with the churches, because, it used to be that when you would go to conferences and you were talking about why is the culture falling apart, people would say, well, there's all these people who, they're going to church all the time, but then they're being ruined by the schools they attend. They're going to these terrible schools and they're being taught all this terrible stuff. I'm seeing a lot more of a different scenario now, which is that you have kids who are being homeschooled, or they are in legitimately good Christian schools, but the churches are ruining them, because the youth pastor is all messed up, or the vacation Bible school, or the pastor himself, or, the church is the place where all of these influences are coming in. And unfortunately, compromise always leads to cancellation, because sooner or later, the people who are still going to stand on the word of God have to be driven out in order to cover for the people who have compromised. But the schools, I think, if you launch schools within churches, I think the schools can bring the churches very often back to where they're supposed to be. They put a check on them, just as the church ideally should put a check on the school. So
well, and also too, I think that having the schools and knowing, so parents know that they're sending their child to actually learn biblical values as well. That's something that, again, is sorely lacking, obviously, in the public school, but then also in a lot of Christian schools. A lot of Christian schools, parents don't know what the teachers are teaching their children, and that's a very dangerous thing. And I think that within the educational sphere, there needs to be more transparency. There needs to be more working with parents and more flexibility, and also having a focus on being upfront and honest and saying, like, no, look, here's the values that we're teaching, here are the principles that we're teaching, and we're teaching actual education, not propaganda, like a lot of times like what we see in the educational sphere.
Right. Well, and also I do want to point out that one of the things that got us to this terrible situation is that people threw trillions, literally, of dollars at building up Christian educational institutions. At the higher education level, they're lost. And it's such hard news to tell people, because everyone has that one Christian college that they think is solid, that they've read headlines, they think they're lost because they all chased after accreditation, and that dragged them down. Almost all of them sank into the mud of accreditation. So the Christian colleges are no longer places where you can go and where you can find refuge. It's a long, complicated story how that happened. But I know from having been on the inside of it, having worked at a Southern Baptist college, they're lost. The seminaries are gone. The divinity schools that are housed in places like Yale and Harvard, these places are gone. They're not going to be havens. That they've basically been taken over by people whose primary concern is advancement according to the academic standards of the unbelieving world. And I don't think that you can roll them back. I think part of the problem was the actual model that we were promoting, the idea of a 4-year degree where a young person at the age of 18 moves away from home when they're at kind of their sexual peak, and they're also reckless, and the front lobe of their brain has not fully developed yet. And we're sending them for 4 years to live in a cloister where they have no responsibility, but they have all the freedom in the world, and they're living on loans. That was a terrible idea. It was a terrible idea. So I think part of educational reform, which we can do because we don't need it. We don't need 4-year degrees for anything. You launch 2-year degrees, which is what Jeff and I are trying to launch through Gatekeepers College. You have 2-year degrees that are online that can be affiliated with churches, so that, again, the churches become the anchor point for those 2-year associate's degrees. There are things that people can get when they graduate from high school simultaneously. That's an increasingly common practice. And then you can just skip the whole 4-year degree program, go right to work. Like, live in your community, go to your church, stay rooted, and just get a trade. I think that the humanities are going to be in that curriculum, but we don't need the 4-year degree where you're sinking all of this money that you don't have, that you're living on with debts, and you're doing that. So I think that there's a lot of reform in education that has to happen. But the good news is, we can build an independent education sphere tomorrow if we want, because we don't really need the public schools for anything. And the accreditation never meant anything. It was never that important. It just, the part of it that we have to work on is we have to build up our roster of Christian-owned workplaces that will respect the degrees that are coming out of the schools that we launch, so that those people have a place to work.
Well, I would also throw out there too, and for me, I've been in the business world, off and on for pretty much my entire adult life, and I worked with a lot of businesses and startups and contracted and all that kind of stuff. And one of the interesting things is that I never once had anybody ask me about my degree. Was your degree accredited? Like, I've never once had anybody ask me that, even though I went to a small, private Christian school. Not once. And so for me, I think, in today's day and age, unless you're going for something specific, like if you want to go be a scientist at Stanford University, you're probably going to have to get an accredited degree. But if you literally want to start a business, you want to go into journalism, you want to become a pastor, you would like to go, I would say probably 98% of the jobs out there, you don't even really need a degree. But I think what we're coming at is, what are the nuts and bolts? What are the important things that you need to know to go into a particular career path? So I know, like, one of the things that we're talking about within our educational sphere in our Gatekeepers College is to have a track for pastors. What are the nuts and bolts? What do we want somebody who leaves and they have this 2-year degree? Are they equipped to actually begin to go into ministry and serve in their local church and at least have a pretty fundamental grasp of everything that they need to know in order to start? Obviously, there's more information and more learning that you always need to do. but this can be the foundation, and we can kind of do this in so many different arenas that where I think we can actually be a lot more effective in a lot less time and a lot less expensive than standard educational practices.
Yeah, well, I think that's the way to go. I think there's so much energy. People they're fed up with the 4-year degrees. And I went to an incredibly pretentious college, in the Ivy League, and I look at it now, and it's almost embarrassing that ever had this stellar reputation. I remember when I was at Yale, it was, I think, number 2 or number 1 in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. And you look at it now, and they're teaching such ridiculous garbage to the students. I mean, the graduates from there they're not attractive candidates on the job market. I think people are figuring this out, that this whole system, I mean, why do you think our country is in such a mess? It's because people from Harvard and Yale are running the entire government. And yes, they were well connected. Yes, they were well groomed, and they were taught how to socialize and how to conform to the elite standards of social behavior, et cetera. But they didn't actually know anything. They didn't know how to run anything because they lived in this world that was so set off from everything. So I think, a truly cancel-proof Christian education is one that I think is going to appeal to a lot of people if we can get it off the ground. That's why I think it's a good starting point. Now, I do want to point out that at this conference, which you can get the tickets to, and I really encourage people to attend this, it's cancelproofchristianity.com. This is the most important project I've ever worked on in my whole life. You can join live streaming if you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. You can join us, in person. But at that conference, we're going to talk about all of the major disciplines and why they all matter. That's another thing that I want to talk about, is the fact that as conservative Christians, very often in the past, we have dismissed whole disciplines, and we did ourselves a lot of damage by doing that. We thought history, well, who cares about history? Back in the 90s, everybody would say, well, just sign up for a Hillsdale Great Books course and then go, study engineering somewhere and go build rockets. Okay. And now people are screaming about critical race theory, and we don't have anybody in the educational establishment who can defend our position, because all the conservatives got driven out, and conservatives just didn't really care about defending their jobs when they were getting fired. So all of these disciplines matter. Languages matter. Literature matters. Mathematics matters. The technical training matters. So do the sciences and the life sciences. So we're going to have people talking about all those things and how Christians need to be in that discipline, and how we have to provide that to people in the schools that we launch. We can't try to launch schools for each of those disciplines. We don't want to be stuck saying, I don't have a textbook to assign, so let me just reach over here and get a textbook from this secular textbook company. Boom, once you've done that, your guards have gone down, and you're going to be back on the road. You're going to be back where you started from. So it's important for us to be working in all of those disciplines and formulating a curriculum that is appropriate for the people that we want to educate.
Oh yeah, and I think it's so important that we have people in each of those spheres, and we're training people in each of those spheres as well, because, like you said, we need Christians in that arena. Like, the reason why we lost Hollywood, the reason why we lost Silicon Valley is not because they're so great. It's because we took ourselves out of it. As Christians, we took ourselves out of that battle, and instead we focused on a lot of blue collar jobs. We focused on the church. We focused on all these other areas, and even politics to a certain degree. But it's almost like we intentionally took ourselves out of the fight when it comes to let's create some good quality movies with conservative values. Let's create some good quality shows. Let's create some good quality music, whatever it might be. But it's, for whatever reason, we took ourselves out of that. And I think the same goes even for like big tech. Everybody's complaining about big tech and Facebook and Twitter. Where were the conservatives for the last 2 decades? Nowhere. Right. It wasn't until it was too late.
Well, and I do, in their defense, I think that it was always an appealing argument to people to say, well, if we just stay in the system, we can change it from within. That was always an appealing argument, and I think that that's part of the reason why conservatives didn't try to develop their own venues for any of this. They thought that if they just kept on working on Amazon and they were a good worker, that somehow their wonderfulness would win everybody over and they'd be able to change the corporate culture of Amazon. And I think now more than ever before, people are realizing this is not working. That it's the Christians who are in these positions are very vulnerable. They're not able to bring their Christian values to the discussion in these venues. Instead, they're being silenced, and they're actually being cast out from a lot of these places just because people find out that they express Christian values off hours in their own private lives. So it's tough. The workplaces is going to be a big part of it, but that's another conference later on. We got to bring together entrepreneurs. We've got to bring together people to be able to generate income from within our community. We can't just all be doing each other's laundry. We have to be able to produce things for ourselves. But I think that what you're talking about, it's true that conservatives and Christians, we pulled out of a lot of disciplines, or we had people in there who thought that if they just kept their head down, they'd be fine. And unfortunately, it didn't work. Do you remember there were so many years, because you're from Southern California too, right? Remember?
Yep.
Okay. Do you remember when people would always talk about the Friends of Abe, how there was this group of conservatives in Hollywood and they were having these meetings and they were going to take back what happened to them? I mean, it never materialized because it was a good idea, but it just can't work. That beast is too big. I think we just need to, cut loose from Hollywood. I mean, it's just, you're trying to like hold a tiger by the tail. It's not going to change.
Well, when you think about this, and this is jumping into the history side of things, but when you think about this, the founding fathers, when they originally established America, like the way that America was established was it was individual responsibility, and you have the American dream. You can make something of yourself. You're free to do that. But the way that America was founded was everybody was kind of their own boss. Like everybody was either they had a farm, they had a store, they had a tiny little local church. It was these small little communities, and they were almost cancel proof when you think about it. I mean, if you're a farmer, okay, so what? So somebody wants to stop buying your meat, you'll just kill your cow and make the meat for at a certain point, you can still put food on your table no matter what if somebody disagrees with you. But when we've allowed these big corporations and we try to working for Amazon that's got millions of employees, or working within Disney, or working within the Hollywood system, or working for Facebook or Twitter or any of these big mega companies, you risk everything because you are 100% reliant upon them. And I think, just like we were talking about, I think it's better to have the smaller, more local churches. Right. The same could be said for our own economy, as well as having more small businesses and where we're working together. And I think if we're more focused on the small business side of things, I think that can kind of create a cancel-proof economy. And that's more looking at the workplace side of things as well.
Right. And that's what Andrew Torba has been talking about, trying to create a parallel economy. And I think he's onto it. I don't like to use the term parallel as much as he does, because parallel to me means that if the secular world is going like this, we're going down the same downward slope, but we're just, you know what I mean, like a little bit behind. I would want it to think like we're going perpendicular off of the trend. We're going in a totally different direction. But yeah, I think you need to have, and this is an area that our movement neglected, and it's our fault, that for a very long time, when there were people who did go out and they took a public stand in favor of the gospel and they lost their jobs, what the conservative and Christian movement told them was not right. They would tell them, "Ooh, it's so tough that you lost your job. I'll be praying for you. I hope you find something else." And we just didn't have anywhere for people to go. And we complained for years and years and years that people were getting canceled for defending the gospel, but we never had a plan as to how we were going to provide work to people, and not just work like as in, "Oh, you lost your job, so now let me give you a check to live on." No, there has to be an entire sphere of activity where Christians can make a living and they can just live from day to day without the fear that taking a public stand for the Bible means that they can't provide for their families. That's what we have to move towards. And I talk about that in the book. I really hope people can take a look at that book, because I talk about when we're discussing building Christian workplaces, part of this is we have to make sure that we don't make, again, the mistakes we made in the past, where there were people who just slapped a Christian label, on terrible, terrible workplaces. I mean, there are Christian labeled workplaces that I've been around that are some of the worst places on earth to work for. Just abusive bosses, no transparency, really corrupt practices. But they're protected because they call themselves religious, and so the government can't get involved. We don't want that. We want Christian businesses that are ethical. That's why the schools have to work in tandem with this. You have to, inculcate people with a really clear ethical sense of what is a Christian way to do business. Okay. There are a lot of passages in the Bible that teach us how Christians can conduct business with each other. And I think if we want to make a cancel-proof economy, we've got to have the armor of God that way. We can't do business the way that the unbelieving world does. And so whenever you're around a Christian person who's in management who says, well, you know what, this is a business decision. I can't make this is not personal. You know what? Are you really Christian then, if that's how you're going to look at it? Because you can't turn off your Christianity just because you're in your office. That's not the way things work. So I think a lot of these issues all go together. It's going to be a big challenge, but I'm excited to kind of tackle this in a series of conferences,
Oh yeah, I think it'll be a lot of fun. I think it's really important, and I think it's something that people are kind of like. There's getting some buzz. There's getting some talk about this kind of thinking, but I haven't really seen anybody except maybe like Andrew Torba, but that's just one specific arena. But I haven't really seen anybody establish kind of what we're talking about, and I think that's why this is so unique, special. To be a part of this, we can begin to launch this and begin again. This is just the beginning. This is just the launching point. This is where we're asking the questions. We're bringing together the experts. We're putting forth the ideas, and then trying to mold this into how do we actually create cancel-proof Christianity.
Yeah, and I think that first of all, go to cancelproofchristianity.com, look at it. Please come to the conference and start. The thing is that Jeff and I are not exclusionary people. We're not people who have an axe to grind. So, we want to get everybody who is Christian and who's interested in this to be able to contribute in one way or another. I think it's an important event, because if we don't start this now, then we're never going to start it. Some of the feedback that I get, you're talking about some of the feedback you got. The feedback I've been getting all year is people say, well, Bobby, the secular world is against you. That's like 50% of America. The Antichrist church, as you call it, is against you. So that's another 30%. Then of that 20% left, probably 19 out of 20 just don't want to be bothered. So you're stuck with 1% of the country that would have any interest in what you're doing. And I say, great, because 1% of America is 3 million people. That is more than the population of the colonies when they overthrew the British in 1776. So, we have to we have to just get away from these economies of scale. We have to just, part of unplugging from the canceling world is you have to unplug from the logic behind it and the proportion and the scales. I mean, with 3 million people, the Amish live, independently with 300,000. And I think we have enough people. We're not going to have to live as primitively as the Amish. I think we'll be able to have, ice cream and, machines and stuff like that. I think we can do pretty well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's just I think what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to wake people up to the reality that this is possible, and it really is. It's really not that difficult when you think about it. It's just a matter of the difficulty of putting it together and pooling the resources and getting people to come together around this common idea. But I think if we can do that, and I really think that this Cancel Proof Christianity Summit, I think, is really going to do that. I think if we can get people around a centralized idea, we can create a movement that can actually fundamentally change the way that we do business, the way that we teach, the way that we do church, the way that we are, influencing people, the way that we're getting our news, whatever it might be. There's so many different alternatives that we can create out of this movement. Right now, it's just about getting people to get behind this concept.
Yes, and I'm going to put right now the contact email that people can contact, and then I will let I will let Jeff Dornick go back to his life in Southern California. That's the email, Berean Lopez at protonmail.com. We're manning that mailbox. If you have any ideas about how to build a cancel-proof Christianity, send your questions there, and make sure that you go visit cancelproofchristianity.com. Look at our lineup. Remember that we're going to have 4 conferences. That's our goal. The first one's on the schools, second one's on the churches, third one's on workplaces, and the fourth one is going to be on the media, which I'm sure that Jeff is going to have a great time because that's a topic that he has a lot of opinions on. All right. Well, thank you very much. And I will be on the airwaves doing more promotion for this conference. But for now, have a great night.